probably all right, and welcome back to Better Understanding the Bible. And today we are talking origins again with Mercy. So thank you, Mercy, for joining us again. Hope things have been going well.
Yes, thanks, Dallas. I'm just getting over a cold, so I hope you don't mind me squeaking here or there, but I think I can talk and join you on this very critical conversation about the Suzerain Vassal Treaty. I'm really excited.
Yeah, it's a big one, and I just want to thank you guys for popping in to give this a listen because this is a big one and probably very, very under discussed. Considering that everybody goes on and on about covenants, this and covenants that, what's a covenant, what's not a covenant, and then realizing, especially from a preteristic point of view, how the entire New Testament's focused on a covenant eschatology and the whole idea of trying to understand what covenant ended, what are covenants, well, how does a covenant end, how does a covenant begin? So it's a very important conversation. Why? Because the Suzerain Vassal Treaty is a covenantal system. So what is all this talking about? That's what we're going to be discussing. Why is that important? Because we like to talk about things that really don't affect the Bible, because those little peripheral cover. No, of course not. These are the big ones. These are the fundamental questions that, depending on how you see the construction of the Bible, as we were speaking in the last conversation about how the Neolithic period has now. Well, we went from the Paleolithic time period that transitioned into the Neolithic time period. And now what we're doing is we're actually evolving that conversation as man evolved his abilities in 3300, 3500 BC to bring in writing. And with the creation of writing, then came in bronze with the tinning of the copper. And all of a sudden, we have new world history. Things started getting written down. Up to that point, we call that prehistory because nothing's written down. We just go by what the evidence looks like because they just didn't have writing. And so when we take a look at these time periods, we do end up coming into a very interesting amount of writing and how much they tend to these treaties that we're talking about, these covenant agreements. So what is a treaty? We're familiar with that, so we're going to stick to that term. Treaties, when two nations, and it's the same context in the Bible, two nations come to an agreement. There's usually a lesser or a greater, or there's two equal groups coming together to decide how they're going to live together in that same land, in that same area. And so we have the suzerain and we have the vassal. So Mercy, I'll hand it off to you if you wouldn't mind giving us a 2-minute whatever definition of what a suzerain vassal system is, because I know you've recently been going through it and you'd love to talk about it. So feel free.
Yeah. Before I touch on that real quick, I mean, I've spent like over 35 years in Christian ministry, hands-on, overseas and in the United States. And with my background of, missions and cultural work and everything like that, I've been told my whole Christian life, and I think this is something the audience can really relate with, is that when the Bible was presented to me, it was, the Bible is a love story. It's God's love for you. And it was very personalized. Or, if you don't know anything about the Bible, it doesn't matter. Just say Jesus, Jesus, and it's his story, and you're going to win. Don't worry about it, right? So we had this, like I had this, a lot of enculturation of what the Bible was. And then as I got a little bit older, it was like a covenant, but it was put in like this framework of it's God's promise to you. And I always wondered about that, like promise of what, And when the Roman Catholic Church came into canonizing the New Testament and all this and putting the Jewish Bible, the Tanakh, together, they named it Old Testament, New Testament, Old Covenant, New Covenant. So we have these words, covenant, all the time, and we think we know it. It's very familiar to us. But what if it was actually written down as treaty? That's a very foreign concept. I know that seems very distant or whatever, but when you actually study the word covenant and where does this come from? It doesn't come from Rome. It doesn't come from Greece. It doesn't come from really like just the Jewish people, because we didn't have any Jewish people before, the Northern Kingdom and the Southern Kingdom split, right? They were all called Israelites. you have to go back all the way to the Israelite history and the forming of that nation. And in that culture, it was this Hittite empire, it was the Mesopotamian empire, the ancient Near East, and they dealt with treaties all the time. And when you look at the Bible and you're like, oh my gosh, here's a fashioning of a kingdom. That's why Jesus is talking about the kingdom, because the kingdom is talking about this treaty. Now my mind is turned a little bit to, oh my gosh, what is actually going on? What is this covenant? So a treaty is between a suzerain who is like the king of kings and the lord of lords. He would be like the emperor or the bigger king. And you had many little kings, little vassal city states all around. You know, right now we're at this time in the Bible, you have a people group, but they're trying to create a civilization. If you're creating civilization, you have to have a king, you have to have a kingdom. So the bigger, the tougher, the more warriors, more resources that they have. They would have been the suzerain, the top guy, which was like the emperor. Their title would have been King of Kings, Lord of Lords, but the vassal would have been a king or lord, right? And so they have this relationship. And what you're seeing in the ancient Near East is that these kingdoms are coming and they're gobbling up the land. And so they're trying to build up treaties, because if you don't have a treaty with the top dog, you don't have resources to the river in that land geography. If you don't have access to any river, that's why all civilizations are surrounded by a river. If you can't tap into that, if you can't tap into the trade routes, you will not survive. Your economy will collapse. So they created this Suzerain Vassal Treaty to establish this, and for both parties to know what are the parameters, what are the boundaries. And the treaty would not exceed outside of the people that wrote that treaty. It was between the suzerain and the vassal. It wouldn't have applied to everybody in the, in Mesopotamia or everyone in Canaan. So when you
Now,
look
not
at,
to derail you, but to also kind of add into that same breath, we got to understand that most of these treaties too are with the greater and the lesser position, meaning a greater kingdom. So let's pick on Egypt, because they appeared in the timeline around that 3100 time, and they were one of the first big boys reigning that so many people were under. And so these little guys, if they didn't submit to Egypt, Egypt would just wipe them out. You're not going
yes,
to leave these enemies that are going to be picking away at you, a problem, and that thorn in your side mentality. They would just wipe you out. So these little communities, they really didn't have a choice. So they became a slave to the suzerain. So there's actually a couple different ways. There's the two greater nations, which we're talking. So like something like Syria and Babylon, two empires that decided, hey, okay, we're going to settle for a little bit. But that was very rare. On smaller levels, there was probably a lot more of the little guys that were, okay, we're even, and they set up trade systems. But
yeah,
when a big guy came in, all those little guys, they had to be under, or they were at war with them. So it
yes,
does create a very powerful dynamic of life. Who are you attached to carries a lot of weight now. And you are attached through that suzerain vassal treaty. Whoever your suzerain is, you're the vassal of, they're either going to protect you or squish you. So
mhm.
depend now you're in allegiance to them. So not to take away with what you're saying, I just wanted to expand because that picture was so relevant in what you're saying.
Yes, and let me just give an example. People are like, okay, well, then this was like, when was this going on? I want to tell the audience this was happening all the way into Genesis. For example, if you look at Genesis 14, when Abram comes together with I think it was 12 kings, and I think like half of them were going against the other one. They actually broke a treaty. So when Abraham is coming in, people don't understand the background of this. But if you understood the Suzerain Vassal Treaty, you would understand it in the sense of Abraham actually had an alliance with some of those kings. And when they decided to come in and go after the other king, Abram recognized who was who and who was a suzerain and who was a vassal, right? And the king came in and they took Lot, they took Sodom and Gomorrah, right? They took the booty and everything. And then Abram rose up and said, hey, you guys over here, I made an alliance to you. Remember what we wrote, what we had to agree on? You need to come. And so they came, and what he went in and he redeemed basically Lot from Sodom and Gomorrah. And that's where you have the picture of Melchizedek coming in and him breaking bread with Melchizedek. This is a very important chapter in Genesis. So no, this we're not talking about something that happens way, way later in Israel's history. We're talking about the very first book of Genesis. It's right there opened before your eyes.
And now, as we were talking in the last conversation, we were saying that when Moses put the Bible together, the question we're looking at is why? What is the narrative of the Bible? The narrative of the Bible is Egypt is, Israel's coming out of Egypt, and they're a new people. They're being created out of the bosom of the darkness of Egypt. Now an unbelieving nation. So they're the light coming out of darkness, so to speak. And we got that neat imagery. And what do we have? We have Moses, or whoever we want to give credit to, that's a different conversation, put the Bible together. The narrative is the birthing and starting of a people. And this is a Deuteronomy, from Genesis to Deuteronomy conversation. And I want to quote from Russell Meek here that talks about the Mount Sinai covenant, who brings up this point saying, the covenant Yahweh established with Israel at Mount Sinai exhibits striking parallels with the Hittite Suzerain Vassal treaties, which had the 6 basic requirements: the preamble, which identifies the suzerain; the historical prologue, which recounts the previous relationships between the parties; covenant stipulations, which the vassal must agree to; provisions for periodic reading and safekeeping of the covenant; a witness to the covenant; and blessings and cursings, whether the vassal shall keep or fail the requirements. Now, these 6 things are all seen through Exodus and Deuteronomy. Now, this is a widely known, widely accepted through the scholarly and even the very unscholarly. This has just become common knowledge now. And to back up what Mercy was saying there, not are we only talking about Moses and the beginning of their covenant, or the covenants of 3100 with Egypt, or even with Jesus. And why do we say Jesus? Well, when Jesus appeared on the screen, Judah rather, had become a vassal state to the Empire of Rome, who was the suzerain. And so we have these pictures.
Before Rome, it was Greece. Before
Yep.
Greece, it was Persia. They had just been released from Babylon, right? And so they're very familiar with what is happening with their economy, with their national identity. So this is very much in their mind, but it doesn't just stop there. It goes all the way back, not just to Moses, but to Abraham, and this covenant, this treaty that's continuing to play out in their current lives at that first century time frame.
And now we're going to do what we like to do, is have fun with this and argue that this actually goes all the way back to Genesis. So now this is where we put on our big boy pants a little bit here and step away. We can't read ourselves in the Bible at all. What we have to do is realize that when this is being put together, Moses, Joshua, and the priesthood in the Bible itself are said to have contributed. Moses wasn't there writing after he died, but the Bible in the first 5 books, he is present because somebody had to write out those final pieces. Anyway, however you want to say, put it together. Like I said, that's a conversation for a totally different day. But what we do see is, again, the significance is that's the beginning of the people of Israel. Why then did Moses bring up Adam? As we concluded, Israel was claiming hereditary descendants' rights to the first empire, so they would have the right to rule. Well, that's the passing on through hereditary covenant or treaty systems. You can't inherit from somebody if there isn't a law there or a system of agreement that people honor. So there was an agreement. And that's the basis for us, the Suzerain Covenant Treaty, the 2 parties and their agreement. And this goes all the way back to Adam. So when we take a look at the Bible, we understand that not only was Israel a nation developed at the time of the Suzerain Vassal Treaty as dominant among the nations and how they communicate with themselves, but while that mind of that, so we have writing created in 3300, Egypt's on the scene in 3100. Babylon's right there at the same time. We have empiric wars now taking place, massive tribal wars and inner city state wars. We're now at the first time where weaponry has actually created mass killing machinery empires. And this is the beginning of great wars and civilizations and peoples. And it was dominated through the use of the Suzerain Vassal Treaty to keep safety in the land. So this is a very needed thing. And here we come along, a new nation's being created in the land, Israel, and they choose to use the Suzerain Vassal Treaty to communicate their position with God. And they claim that they get that right by going all the way back to Adam. In fact, and now this is where we can have a little bit of fun, when we read the preamble is the first part, which identifies the suzerain, and the historical prologue that recounts the previous relationship between the parties, we actually see that in Genesis. That's actually where we see the greatness of God being displayed and the beginning of the relationship with Adam, who becomes Abraham, who becomes Israel. So from Adam to Israel, which is Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, because as soon as we hand the book over to Joshua, the Suzerain Vassal Treaty is completed. So we actually have a very interesting system here, because we also need to have the covenant stipulations, which we have in Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. We need to have the witnesses, and how many times the Torah says God has brought the heaven and earth as witness against you today. And then we have the provisions for the reading and the safekeeping of the covenant, which was demanded in Deuteronomy, that once a year or at special festivals that the covenant would be brought out and read. And then finally, we'd have the blessings and the cursings should the vassal not live up to its stipulations, which is heavily laid out in Leviticus and Deuteronomy and even parts of Numbers. And then finally, which ends it, which is the succession going forward. How is this to play out in future generations? Which in Deuteronomy, we actually see this in 32, the Song of Moses. This is how this will all come to an end. And so we actually see through Genesis with the historical prologue how God came into being, into his relationship with Israel. We got to keep that in mind. Why does Genesis go to Joshua? So why does it end at Deuteronomy? Because it takes all that time and language to establish that Israel came from that covenant member in order to bequeath to them those covenant rights.
Absolutely.
So I know I've thrown a lot out there, a lot of information. I hope people are enjoying it. Just a little trying to bridge the gap here about why is it so important that we know what a suzerain vassal treaty is, because it's going to fundamentally shape how we see what's being written and why it's being written.
Right. And people need to know that this is actually the backbone of the Bible. Your channel is all about better understanding the Bible, right? This is the actual backbone, meaning the skeletal system, or I use the word, I think, Dallas, you like to use type, motif. I like to use the word framework. And just for the audience, for them to know, you had George Mendelssohn in the 1950s and Klaus Baltzer that actually started to see this once they received and could have interpreters interpret the cuneiform tablets, which we have over 1 million of. And it took them a while for people to actually, interpret it and understand it. And these two guys recognized that this was, oh my gosh, this is similar to the Bible, right? And so that was the 50s. And then you had Meredith Kline that came in around the 60s and 70s, started to write about this. And, this is scholarly work. And so it takes such a long time for these kinds of really groundbreaking concepts to trickle down to the pastoralship, trickle down to the church congregation, right? It's been so long. And right now we're talking about this. And why we're making this video is to really bridge that gap of, okay, fine, we see this in Exodus, we see this in Deuteronomy, but what does it mean for us today? And there are new people coming in, like you just read Russ Meek, but there's Julian Spriggs, Ralph Wilson, Alice Lindsay. There are people now that are writing about this application of like, okay, do you understand that the Bible, it's more than just a covenant, it's more than just a love story, it's more than just a promise. It's actually dealing with a specific covenantal group that had a treaty, and God was a suzerain. The vassal state was Israel, and there was a royal messenger that came between them to deliver this message. That's why Jesus came as a prophet, right? All of these guys came onto the scene and say, hey, Moses was a prophet, right? To what? To talk about this treaty that had a beginning, and then Jesus closes it as he actually fulfills this treaty. It's a beautiful story, but we get all entangled in all kinds of nonsense that has nothing to do with the Bible because it's so steeped in tradition. And when we want people, and I think your audience, they're ready to hear this. And that's why we're making this video, because it is absolutely the backbone of the Bible. If you don't understand this, then you don't really know what you're reading.
Well, and to keep it in its historical position too is very extremely important, because we are talking about something that we do kind of have some information about. Like there are other nations that are growing and developing in the same exact system, maybe at different times, but they're flowing in this same process, almost as if a child is being raised, or it's just the natural progression of how a flower comes out of the ground and blooms and dies. It's just part of this is how it's supposed to be. Society, and like you had said, civilization comes up around rivers. So we do have that all around. And of course, that makes just logical sense. And that's what we're trying to bridge the gap on here, is that logical sense. Of course, there would need to be a water source. If there was no water source, there's no food. And that's just the way it is. So, of course, you need to have a stable water supply. And so we see these things, and then we also have to take into account. So we're moving from the Paleolithic time period into the Neolithic time period, and there's a developmental stage that's going on. Now, during this development, we also have other things developing that have never existed before that need to develop, like economy. Like I'm sure there was tribal trading, but there was probably never, uh, you know, too many consequences to the degree of raiding and all that, to the once we get into this Neolithic time period where we get to cities of tens of thousands. So we're big transition. And now we're going into a transition where slavery becomes a real issue. When you're running a society that has tens of thousands of peoples and you're part of the slave trade, it's just going to be a big, we just see how it affects everybody. And now the rules of the land, it doesn't matter how big or how small you are, is controlled by the suzerain. And everybody needs to know what the rules are, and they're ratified in the Suzerain Vassal Treaty. Now, everybody was around at this time knew this. But the thing was, the suzerain, like you said, is the king over the vassal. Nowhere in the entire Bible does it talk about all of the earth being all that we know of. Does it ever talk about that? Because it's only ever talking about that local area. And of course it would. We're talking about a localized area. Sure, city with 40,000 people. That's ginormous back in that day. Let's compare that to New York. Let's compare it to Los Angeles. Let's compare it to, so they're not even close to what we have for modern cities. But at that time, that was the be all end all of civilization. So, and let's bring a friendly reminder to how far away we're talking about. If we go all the way up to Rome, they used to have public toilets with where you'd sit down and there'd be a long trough and you would sit elbow to elbow dropping, you dookie with your, friend talking about politics. It's not like there was a huge growth period between the Neolithic period and the time when Jesus arrived. That was an age, and people were stuck in those limitations. And we got to understand that those limitations are the mind that wrote the Bible. And yes, God was working with the people, but he was limited by that people. And so when we take a look at the Bible, and I don't want to say limited, because they had their, the Suzerain Vassal Treaty system is quite particular. Like, you can spend your whole career just describing it. And there's a reason for it. We still to this day see the stereotype of Jews and lawyers because their entire culture is wrapped around understanding the law, the legal document that governed the treaty between them and God. And so this is super, super, super serious to understand because of its impact and how we need to perceive the Bible. Because we, as much as we want, are not the focus of the Bible. The focus of the Bible was taking that picture. We have this picture that's reaching all the way back in time before the Neolithic period, before bronze, before writing, before citied walls. We're talking about at the forming of the first civilizations known.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the time period. So we're looking at the very beginnings. Well, how do we know? Well, we have Eden, we have boundaries, we have Nod, another boundary. So we're coming into those things. They were figuring these things out. But what we do know is they were doing so duplicating the suzerain vassal treaty systems. And so it's really important to understand that whoever wrote, and now here comes that biased thing, whoever wrote Genesis was writing it in a suzerain vassal treaty system because at the time they wrote it, that's what was common to them.
Absolutely. And there's
So just to finish up my whole point with that is, if Moses is talking about the creation of Israel and he's submitting them to a suzerain vassal treaty, saying that they attach themselves to God because of it, and they're pulling out of history all the way back to Adam, of course, Adam's going to be also described in a suzerain vassal treaty. That's
Mhm.
all he knew. Why wouldn't he write it that way? So that's kind of my bigger point behind it. I took a lot of time there, Mercy, so feel free.
Yeah, and I think there's evidence here because you're talking about a civilization where people are coming together and they're living longer. What do you do with that? And you brought in the slave trade. That was huge in the economy there because you're having tons of people and they need work. And what do they do with that? And so as a suzerain would come in, a lot of times when the suzerain would come in and take over a vassal state, um, to be the new succession of that king, they would actually release the captives or the prisoners so that he could have favor with the new vassal state. And so jubilee concept coming in. And when we talked about the Suzerain Vassal and the five parts, the preamble is the very first one. What I see in the book of Genesis, they're like, well, let me, what is it? Where is it in Genesis? Well, I find it very interesting that the language is very similar in the preamble in Genesis, where it says, I am the Lord your God. And he's talking to Abraham. And he says, I have brought you or taken you out of the land of Ur into the land of promise. And we have that same phraseology, which is like a very short preamble, an introduction of the suzerain king, the suzerain king of kings and the Lord of lords. And so when you look in Exodus, here is Moses, it's his time frame. He is, now being asked to bring these people out. In the same context in Exodus, God says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery, right? And so, what is happening here with the suzerain vassal treaty is that God is saying, I am the suzerain. And because I have redeemed you, I've ransomed you out of the kingdom of Egypt. Now, what we're seeing is these words that we think are so spiritual and are so Christian, redeemed, salvation, what's in a ransom, right? And even holy people or treasured people. A lot of times, what these suzerains would do is they would then take these people and offer them up, and they wouldn't have to pay tribute or taxes. And they would then say, now you have to worship this God. And so you would be a class of priests, When Moses is coming out, the same thing is happening. The suzerain God is basically saying, you are a kingdom of priests. It says that in Exodus 19:6. I'm calling you out to be a kingdom of priests, and you are to worship me. And in the land of a sacred, they called it a sanctity, a sacred area where you would now be representing me, and you would be now worshiping me. That was the promised land that they had to cross over to go to. The Suzerain Vassal Treaty actually wrote down those parameters there, because now you're talking about, how do I work in civilization? Well, you have to have laws. They didn't have laws before. Now they're writing down laws. So they're like, oh, if we write this down and it's legitimized, and we have a suzerain over us and he's protecting us, and the other people know about this, okay, then we can actually prosper and grow, multiply, and develop as a people group. That's what we're seeing in the Torah.